Okay, folks, so let's begin. Good evening, everyone. I'm Paul Braminat. I'm the director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society here at UVic, and welcome to our 9th Thursday public lecture of the winter series. These talks give us a chance to show off the wonderful work being done by the grad students, UVic faculty, and visiting scholars at the CSRS. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Dominique Claydet from the Philosophy Department at the University of Quebec à Montréal, or UQAM for short. Dr. Leydet has been at UQAM since 1993. She specializes in political philosophy, legal philosophy, and democratic theory. She has been the director of the Center of Interdisciplinary Research on Diversity and Democracy at UQAM since January 2017. I want to highlight just two of her publications that have a bearing on our lecture and that really echo our wishes to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanish people whose historical relationships with land continue to this day. For example, I'll note that she co-edited Modération ou Extrémisme, Regard critique sur la loi 21, which came out with University of Laval Press in 2020. In 2020, she also edited a special issue of International Journal of Minority and Group Rights on the topic of the right of Indigenous peoples to free, prior, and informed consent. Now, to be in an interdisciplinary research center with lots of community engagement, you need to be comfortable making arguments to and being in relationship with people who don't know very much about the field in which you've given several decades of your life. This always requires people to translate and to speak across intellectual and social chasms. I've really appreciated Dominique's wisdom and the clarity of her contributions to our efforts to think together and to think across cultures and paradigms. Today, she addresses related themes as they emerge in conversations around Indigenous and non-Indigenous legal traditions. And so without further delay, I'm very happy to welcome Dominique Claydet to the digital stage.
So thank you so much, Paul, for this kind introduction. And let me start by saying how happy I am to be here at the CSRS and at University of Victoria. I am learning so much, and I want you to take this public lecture as a kind of progress report on the work that I have been doing here, not as a finished product. So as Paul mentioned, I teach democratic theory and the philosophy of law at UQAM. Over the years, I have developed an interest in Indigenous law and legal thought. I come to this field as a Québécois settler. My mother is a Tremblay, whose family was originally from the Charlevoix and moved to the Saguenay in the 1920s, two regions situated in the Nitassinan of the Innu. My father was born in France from an American mother and a French father, and came to live in the Saguenay in the 1950s, where he met my mother. My family moved to Montreal in the 1970s, land of the Kanien'kehá:ka and other Indigenous nations, and this is where I still live and teach today. As part of my undergraduate teaching duties, I co-teach the course Philosophy of Law with a colleague from the Faculty of Law to a mixed audience of philosophy and law students. One of the themes that we addressed in the second half of the course is the Canadian legal order's relation to Indigenous legal traditions. One of my frustrations over the years had been the lack of readings in French that address this theme from an Indigenous perspective. This frustration was shared by other colleagues working in Francophone law schools. Though Indigenous authors like Tayake Alfred, Leanne Simpson, and Glenn Coulthard had been translated in French for some time, none of the publications of the many Indigenous legal scholars who have made the field so dynamic over the past 20 years were accessible in French until we decided to translate John Burroughs' book, Canada's Indigenous Constitution. Voilà. Okay, great. The project started in the autumn of 2017 when I met John Burroughs at a seminar in Montreal and suggested that we translate one of his books. After some discussion with colleagues, the feeling was that Canada's Indigenous Constitution, published in 2010, was the best candidate for translation. Our main pitch to the Presse Universitaire du Québec was that this book was likely to be used in Francophone law schools as a kind of textbook on Indigenous law in Canada. That pitch proved successful, and the translation, completed by Geneviève Newton's Geneviève Motard and me, was finally published at the end of 2020. I'm told that it is used as a required reading, pretty much as we had hoped. So in many ways, this is a happy story. But something that I read last summer on the advice of one of my graduate students, Olivier Sanson, has made me pause. In Parler en Amérique, colonialisme, territoire et oralité, Dali Giroux discusses the accelerating wave of translations into French of works written by indigenous authors in different fields. She asks many good questions, and one of them is the starting point of this talk. So you have it here on the screen. Who is translated and why? Who is not translated? Future research will be able to study the choices that have been made, the strategies that have been adopted, and those that have been left aside. The history of translation in a colonial context is both rich in possibilities, encounters, and learning, while also full of political difficulties. I was struck by this passage because of another book that Burroughs published in 2010, entitled Drawing Out Law, A Spirit's Guide, a book that he often presents as a companion book to the CIC, Canada's Indigenous Constitution. As Burroughs explained in the preface to Drawing Out Law, both books make an argument in favor of a multi-juridical Canada, one in which indigenous legal traditions occupy their rightful place alongside the two main traditions of law in this country, the civil law and the common law. However, whereas CIC makes this argument and discusses indigenous law in Western legal and philosophical terms, in Drawing Out Law, Burroughs attempts to model an Anishinaabe legal method. The result is a very different kind of book, as a quick comparison of the table of contents of the two books illustrate. So here you have the table of contents of Canada's Indigenous Constitution. So it's a very classical way of portraying Indigenous law. I will come back to that. And then here's the table of contents of Drawing Out Law. So of course, the first thing that strikes you is the use of Anishinaabe in the titles of each section of the book. You have to go to the endnotes of the book to find a translation of those words. Moreover, the book's structure follows the outline of a well-known Anishinaabe story, The Four Hills of Life, as told by Basil Johnston, a famous storyteller and elder from Burroughs' own community. In that story, a young man has a dream about 4 hills and goes to see an elder to help him understand his dream. In the book itself, we follow the tribulations of a young Anishinaabe law professor who grapples with a similar recurring dream and who tries to understand its meaning through conversations with his grandparents, whom we also follow in their dreams and reflections. The different characters in the book, some humans, some other than humans, all contribute in different ways to a collective enterprise of coming to a better understanding of the young professor's vision of the place of Anishinaabe law in Canada and of the risks involved. Burroughs tells us that the book itself is based on dreams that he had and discussed with his daughter, Lindsay. He also read and discussed sections of the book to his family in Cape Croker as he was revising it. What makes the book unique is that instead of attempting to describe from the outside elements of an indigenous legal tradition, this is what we get in chapter 3 of CIC, Burroughs tries to express how he, as an Anishinaabe, thinks about and with Anishinaabe law. The book, he says, is very much the product of how I reason about and understand Anishinaabe law. Whereas Canada's Indigenous Constitution uses what is, for us, settlers educated in the Western academic world, a conventional mode of reasoning, we find in Drawing Out Law a mode of reasoning that proceeds from an Anishinaabe perspective. This explains the importance of stories, of dreams, of pictographic forms, of nature itself as the main sources for the reflections that the main characters of the book, the young man and his grandparents, share, and that together exemplify a distinctive mode of collective deliberation. The two books were written with two distinct primary audiences in mind. While CIC is primarily addressed to the non-Indigenous Canadian public, Burroughs' first audience in writing Drawing Out Law was his Anishinaabeg family and community. However, both in the preface and near the end of Drawing Out Law, Burroughs expresses the hope that non-Indigenous legal scholars will be able to read and understand Drawing Out Law as legal literature. Burroughs does not seem entirely secure in this hope, however. At the beginning of the book, he confesses that he would rather not include a preface in which he briefly explains to his non-Indigenous readers the purpose and the method he uses in the book. He would rather that his non-Indigenous readers jump directly into chapter 1 to experience more sharply their encounter with Anishinaabe legal methodology. But the preface is there, and I must confess that without it, I would not have been able to understand the book as a piece of legal writing. In fact, it took me quite a long time to do so. And this explains in large part my original feeling that Canada's Indigenous Constitution was the better candidate for translation in French. Now, is the fact that most Indigenous readers might not be able to understand Drawing Out Law as a piece of legal literature really a problem? After all, we have Canada's Indigenous Constitution. We also have the many other books that have been published since 2010 by Burroughs and other Indigenous legal scholars that make the case for Indigenous law in a legal style readily understandable to us. But I do think that there is a problem, and we can start seeing what the problem is when we reflect on a key passage that appears at the end of Drawing Out Law's preface. And there it is. So this is what he says, and I've just put a part of that quote here on the screen. An examination of both works, so both CIC and Drawing Out Law, will reveal that I believe Anishinaabe and other North American legal traditions and philosophies can be brought into conversation with one another. However, a close study of both works will also illustrate my view that the tone and method of engagement across cultures should change with the context in which the debate is set. The differing voice and style of these two books exemplifies the point that legal pluralism is alive and strong, but should not be reduced to one kind of argument that creates a fused or shared horizon. What Burroughs is saying here is that each kind of argument and style, Indigenous and Western, has its own appropriate context, and we should not expect one kind of argument to dominate across these contexts. But this, I think, requires that each partner in the conversation understand and recognize the other traditions involved as using legitimate, though distinctive kinds of legal arguments. It does not mean that we all need to become fluent in those other modes of argumentation, but that we recognize, respect, and understand them as distinct modes of legal reasoning. In other words, if legal pluralism is not to be reduced to one kind of argument that creates a fused or shared horizon, we, the non-Indigenous folks, need to accept that the law can have other sources and that its agents display other modes of legal reasonings than the ones that are conventional for us. And we need to be able to recognize them as such without requiring that they be expressed in our terms. As Jeremy Weber wrote in Legal Pluralism and Agency, legal orders are reasoned orders, their members engaged in reflection, argument, and reinterpretation. To respect the orders, one must respect their processes of reasoning, their resources for normative argument, and perhaps also their mechanisms for decision-making. Though some progress in this direction has been made over the last 15 years, we still have a long way to go. And what I want to do in this lecture is discuss how the complex nature of Indigenous law, in which the spiritual, the moral, the political are all woven together, presents a challenge to the Western legal discourse. My emphasis will be more specifically on the issues that the spiritual dimension of Indigenous law raises in this respect. So I come to the first real section of the lecture, entitled Law as a Total Social Phenomenon. So one of the key characteristics of modern European law, as it evolved over the last centuries, is the differentiation of legal processes and institutions from other social spheres, so that, as Anishinaabe legal scholar Aaron Mills puts it, the law may act independently from economic, political, cultural, spiritual considerations. In indigenous societies, in contrast, legal traditions appear as one aspect of, and I quote, comprehensive and inseparable practices and bodies of knowledge. In these societies, writes Mills, legal traditions are akin to what French anthropologist Marcel Mauss has called a total social phenomenon, in which, and here Mills is quoting Mauss, all kinds of institutions are given expression at one and the same time, religious, juridical, and moral, which relate to both politics and the family, likewise economic ones. In that context, when one describes an institution or process like the potluck as legal, what one is really doing is highlighting the legal aspect of a mixed institution or process. Mills is not alone in noting this important difference between indigenous and Western legal traditions. André Boissel, in her work on the Stolo legal order, notes that the Stolo legal tradition does not construct law as a separate field of action or body of knowledge. Studying this kind of legal order, she writes, requires approaching norms, and I quote, within their broader context, informed by the overlapping knowledges that have been within Western or European traditions of thought and learning, distinguished and differentiated over time. Sarah Morales, who is a professor at the Faculty of Law here at UVic, and who works on the Hulkaminam legal tradition, writes that the first of the fundamental categories of law that comprise the Hulkaminam legal tradition is Snowwoyul. It is a Hulkaminam word, she writes, that means our way of life. It includes our language, our governance, our culture and traditions, our sacred bathing holes. It also embraces our spirituality and all the teaching. Snowwoyul helps regulate our relationships and resolve our disputes. It contains standards and practices for judgment and decision-making. It touches on all aspects of life and cannot be separated from our relations to each other, to the natural world, or to the spiritual world. These statements, and I could multiply references, point to an important asymmetry between Western and Indigenous law. In Canada's Indigenous Constitution, where Burroughs' main objective is to argue that Indigenous law should take its rightful place alongside the common law and the civil law, this multifaceted character of Indigenous law is presented in terms of a diversity of sources. This strategy allows Burroughs to present Indigenous law in a way that is familiar to those who work within a Western legal tradition, while also highlighting the distinctiveness of Indigenous law in contrast to Western law. So Burroughs distinguishes 5 sources of Indigenous law: sacred, natural, deliberative, positivistic, and customary. So I'll say a few words on each of those sources. The sacred covers laws that, Burroughs tells us, stem from the Creator, creation stories, or the revered ancient teachings that have withstood the test of time. Natural law points here to something quite different from the subjectivist conception of natural law that triumphs in the Europe of the 17th and 18th century. It refers here to laws that result from Indigenous people's observations of the physical world around them. Deliberative law refers to laws that are elaborated through processes of persuasion, deliberation, counsel, and discussion, and these processes can be either formal and highly structured or informal. Positivistic law refers to the law that has as its source the proclamations, rules, regulations, codes, teachings, and axioms that are regarded as binding or regulating people's behavior. Here, the law has weight because the proclamations are made by a person or by a group regarded by a sufficient number of people within a community as authoritative. So let's say hereditary chiefs, clan mothers, headmen, band leaders, etc. And customary law is defined by Burroughs in a very conventional fashion. Customary law refers to the practices developed through repetitive patterns of social interaction that that are accepted as binding on those who participate in them. Okay, so the description of the sources of indigenous law that we find in Burroughs offers a stark contrast with the legal positivist pyramid of the sources of law that you may be familiar with if you had a philosophy of law or a law class. You will remember the pyramid with the constitution at the very top, statutes and judicial decisions somewhere in the middle, and at the very bottom, customs. But you can see how different it is. And of course, there is no place in that pyramid for sacred or natural law in this sense of the term. Okay. Now, as Burroughs points out, the distinction between the different sources of indigenous law should not be reified. In the real world, he writes, indigenous legal traditions usually involve the interaction of two or more of the sources described above. In fact, in practice, it would be hard to separate them one from the other. He also writes that the recognition, enforcement, and implementation of sacred laws can often be regarded as foundational to the operation of the other laws. This points to an understanding of the sources of indigenous law as multi-layered, an understanding that has been explicitly formulated by Aimé Kraft, an Anishinaabe and Métis legal scholar, in a 2018 essay on Anishinaabe law. So this is a representation of the sources of indigenous law that I find extremely powerful. You can really understand, in a sense, the holistic and multi-layered character of indigenous law. Each level of law, writes Kraft, is part of a set of concentric circles dependent on each other for a complete legal understanding, all of it sourced in spiritual law. Here is her description of how it works. Spiritual law, the Creator's law, is the first law of our people, the law which is given to us through ceremony or creation stories, and understanding the teachings about relationships to everything around us. Natural law is derived from spiritual law in the following way. As humans, we observe the application of spiritual law in the natural environment as applied by other beings in creation. In other words, with a basic spiritual instruction, we are able to connect to our original mother, the earth, and from her and all other beings in creation, we learn natural law. This is done primarily through observations of how the beings of the earth act and interact. And her category of human law encompasses what Burroughs means by deliberative and positivist law. Okay, Burroughs and Kraft's analysis both highlight the foundational role of spiritual law. We should note, however, that spiritual law, which is carried in indigenous cultures by creation stories and other sacred teachings, has little in common with the divine positive law of the Judeo-Christian world. If you think, for instance, of the Decalogue that comprises a set of strict commandments. What is given through creation stories, sacred teaching and ceremonies, as I understand it, is a body of knowledge that calls for interpretation and elaboration. Moreover, in indigenous societies, the process of interpretation and normative elaboration is not under the sole purview of a specialized group of people, but is the responsibility of each and all with appropriate guidance and protocols. It is a collective or collaborative enterprise that involves deliberation. So here's an example to show how it works more concretely. This is a case that I take from Chapter 9 of Canada's Indigenous Constitution. So it is a contemporary example that Burroughs gives us of what a process for deciding appropriate conduct can look like following Anishinaabe law. And so here I will give you an abridged version of Burroughs' account to illustrate how the different sources of law are mobilized to arrive at a decision in a particular situation. Okay. About 20 years ago now, Burroughs tells us in Chapter 9 of CIC, the Chippewas of the Nawash on the Cape Croker Indian Reserve had to decide whether to move the site of a summer festival that takes place each year on their reserve, given increasing numbers of participants and visitors. One suggestion was to move the festival to the prairie, a broad, flat, and largely treeless stretch of land lying below Jones Bluff. And you have it on the screen. The prairie could accommodate large crowds and was not far from the main road. However, when it became apparent that a road would have to be built to facilitate access to the prairie, a significant community movement developed that drew on Anishinaabe legal principles. At issue was the fact that the land is host to a significant alvar. The alvar is among the oldest exposed stone in Ontario, having an age of more than 440 million years. For many Anishinaabe, writes Burroughs, the alvar is a storyteller who recounts the time when the land was younger and was covered by shallow tropical seas. The alvar is also home to spiritually significant spirit trails. Family stories speak of the place as having significant sacred power, with accounts of bear walkers, deceased relatives, and supernatural transformers traversing over the area. Armed with this knowledge, there was consultation, debate, discussion, direct experience on the land, prayer, and persuasion about the use of the alvar. Scientists and Anishinaabe lawyers, band counselors, grandmothers, elders, artists, medicine people, community employees, and others participated in a process that drew strongly on Anishinaabe law, respecting Anishinaabe spiritual beliefs. Ceremonies were conducted and traditional teachings reviewed. This legal process led to a decision to stop the prairie's development. Community deliberation, naturalistic observations drawn from scientists and elders, and sacred teachings were all drawn upon to respect and show reverence towards the life force of what others might regard as a barren rock. This led to a positivist law resolution whereby the band declared that the alvar would not host the annual powwows in the community. Okay, so you see this is a case where you see that those different sources of Anishinaabe law that are woven together and are mobilized by the community to arrive at a formal decision. Now I come to the problem. Seen from a standard Western legal perspective, this process mixes elements that would normally fall under different headings. In particular, the fact that the alvar is home to spiritually significant spirit trails, that family stories speak of the place as having significant sacred power, etc. All this looks as though it should fall under the heading spiritual or religious beliefs. From the perspective of Western law, they may be the object of the law's protection, but they are not part of legal discourse. More importantly, perhaps, the sacred teachings mentioned by Burroughs are not considered in the civil or the common law as appropriate sources of law. When faced with the complex and holistic character of an indigenous legal process, a standard reaction for those trained in the Western academic world is to abstract from or bracket those dimensions of indigenous law that do not fit with our conception of law. This is a reaction that expresses our discomfort. We treat them as spiritual or religious beliefs worthy of respect and perhaps of protection. We do not feel authorized to express an opinion or a judgment on those beliefs. We also feel that they are not directly relevant to the law as we understand it. What, from the point of view of the participants in an indigenous legal tradition, appears as part of one complex process of collective deliberation about appropriate conduct gets segmented or pigeonholed into separate categories, some of which are recognized as part of legal discourse and others not. In doing so, we superimpose our conception of law on indigenous conceptions in a way that can only lead to distortions. One way to respond to this problem is to show that in Western societies, the legal field's claim to autonomy from the fields of morality or religion is exaggerated, and that in fact, state law in Canada as elsewhere is deeply embedded in the majority's culture and traditions, including its religious tradition. For instance, scholars like Benjamin Berger have shown how the law in Canada apprehends religious claims or issues through a Judeo-Christian lens. This is all true. I fear, however, that if that strategy is our only focus, we may end up minimizing the very real difference that remains between the standard Western legal approach and that of indigenous peoples, and perhaps miss what we also need to do if we are to truly respect indigenous legal orders as legal orders. If respecting indigenous legal orders means respecting, to use again Jeremy Weber's words, their process of reasoning and their resources for normative argument, then we need to do more than recognize that our religious traditions have left their imprint on our own legal order. We need to recognize that spirituality, as well as the natural world, can remain a source of law. We also need to acknowledge the fact that ceremonies and sacred teachings may be part of a legal process of reasoning and may remain resources for normative argument, though they play no explicit role in our own legal discourse. To illustrate more concretely what I'm trying to say here, I will use as an example a recent case that has proved particularly controversial, the 2017 Supreme Court decision in Naha First Nation v. British Columbia. So, you may recall that in 2012, Naha First Nation brought a petition for judicial review of a decision made by the BC Ministers of Forest Lands and Natural Resources to permit the construction of a ski resort in a wilderness area that is sacred to them. The area in question, called Katma by the Naha, is part of the Jumbo Valley. The case made its way through the lower courts and was finally heard by the Supreme Court in 2016. In 2017, a majority of the Supreme Court decided against the Naha claims. Those claims concerned, on the one hand, the protection of religious freedom under Section 2 of the Charter, and on the other hand, their right to an appropriate consultation under Section 35. The majority found that the freedom of religion guaranteed under Section 2 only protects the right of individuals to hold beliefs and perform acts of worship. It does not protect the object of belief and worship, in this case, the sacred site of Katmuk and the grizzly bear spirit that resides there. The court also found that the consultation requirements under Section 35 had been satisfied. This, in a nutshell, is what the case looks like from the perspective of the Canadian legal process. If we want to have an idea of what it looks like from the perspective of the Naha legal order, we may turn to the Katma Declaration proclaimed in 2010 by the Naha Nation Council on behalf of the Naha Nation. In this document, the Naha officially declared the establishment of a refuge area in the upper part of the Jumbo Valley, I quote, to fully protect the most sacred core of the Katma area, as well as the establishment, and again I quote, of a buffer area consisting of the remainder of the Jumbo watershed, so that the grizzly bear spirit, as well as grizzly bears, can thrive within and around Katmuk. The declaration also signaled a willingness to share Katmuk with non-Naha if, I quote, such use is respectful of Naha spiritual values and consistent with our Katmuk stewardship principles. Those stewardship principles, stated briefly in the declaration, entailed that no buildings or structures with permanent foundations could be constructed in the refuge and buffer area. This, in short, meant a rejection of, by the Naha Nation of the proposed ski resort. If we recall the Alvar case described by Burroughs in CIC, we can read the Katma Declaration as a positivist law resolution whereby the Naha Nation Council declared that a ski resort could not be built in the Katma. This resolution was the result of a reasoning process grounded in Naha law, as the declaration itself explains. And here I have just a quick few excerpts of the declaration. So you see here what it says. The Naha creation story states that the Naha people were created in our territory where we will remain as keepers of the land. The creation story also speaks to our obligation to care and respect the land and all things on it, living and non-living. These teachings come together into Naha law. And then the declaration moves from this broad statement of Naha law to its stewardship philosophy, which is grounded in that law, and then states the Naha stewardship principles. These include the following. Contribute to the betterment of future generations, balance the economic use of land with cultural and spiritual values, follow natural law, and taking only what is needed, etc., etc. So it is in applying these principles or values that the Tunaha came to the decision that building structures with permanent foundations in the Katma was unacceptable. By what process or mechanisms did the Tunaha arrive at this interpretation of their law's implications? There is no clear answer to that question because the Tunaha legal process is of little interest to the Canadian courts. We can only hypothesize that the process that led to the Tunaha Nation's decision is as varied as what Burroughs describes in the case of the Chippewas, of the Nawash, and the Alvar. What I want to emphasize here is that in the Canadian legal process, the conclusion arrived at by the Tunaha, namely that the construction of the resort will cause the grizzly bear spirit to leave the area, that conclusion appears as a religious belief. The first issue that the courts had to decide was whether this belief is protected under Section 2A of the Charter. And in the Tunaha case, as I've already mentioned, a majority of the Supreme Court decided that the belief was not protected because Section 2A protects the beliefs themselves, not the objects of it. Yeah. The Tunaha Nation framed their claim before the courts in freedom of religion terms as part of the strategy to stop the project. When we read the Katma Declaration, however, we realize that framing the issue in these terms is an oversimplification, an oversimplification that distorts the Tunaha position and obscures the nature of the reasoning and of the process that led to this position. As the Supreme Court curtly noted, the declaration affirms the Tunaha people the Tunaha people's pre-existing and inherent sovereignty over their land, based on the Tunaha having been created in interdependence with the land, its living things, and the spirit world. Sovereignty here means an obligation of stewardship towards the land and the beings that exist on it, including the grizzly bears and the grizzly bear spirit. The principles of stewardship, as we saw, are themselves sourced in the Tunaha spiritual and natural law. The decision to reject the proposed resort is best understood as a result of a process of reasoning about the implications of these principles as applied to the proposed resort. Let me now focus on the way the courts understood the religious belief at issue in a court case, the belief that the construction of the resort will lead to the departure from Katmuk of the grizzly bear spirit and the loss of the site's spiritual values. In the court's narrative, much is made of the fact that the Tunaha's position towards the ski resort project hardened in 2009 because of a revelation received by one elder in 2004. According to the court's summary of the facts, this is what led the Tunaha to decide that no accommodation with the promoters of the project was possible. This position was communicated to the minister in a meeting that was held in September of 2009. It is noted that the health problems suffered by the elder in question, Chris Luke, seemed to have caused a delay in communicating this, to the minister. The hardening of the Tunaha's opposition is described as a new and somewhat surprising development because, though the importance of the Katmuk as a sacred site had been mentioned early on, the specific belief in a grizzly bear spirit and the proposed resort's impact on its presence in the Katmuk was not. Moreover, the Tunaha's participation in the environmental review process that started in 1995 had led the project's proponents and the government to believe that compromise was possible and that the Tunaha were amenable to a negotiated agreement. The impression that the religious belief that made compromise impossible came late in the day and was based on the testimony of a single elder seems to have worked against the Tunaha. This is clear in the lower court's decision. For example, the trial judge writes that, and I quote, "When the Tunaha did say that no accommodation of the proposed resort is possible, it seems that their position was based on the epiphanial reflection of one elder, which arose in 2004. It seems that the majority at the Supreme Court, though more careful than the trial judge, shared this skepticism about the genuineness of the Tunaha's belief. Though the majority states that, and I quote, "whether this belief is ancient or recent plays no part in our Section 2A analysis," it refers to the Tunaha position as the late 2009 claim, no less than 14 times in analyzing the issue. Quite a few commentators have noted that what appeared like a late and self-serving disclosure of the belief that the grizzly bear spirit would leave Katma if the resort was built raised evidentiary issues for the majority. How did this fit with the Tunaha's own narrative of the case? In a recent article, Michael P. Carroll has attempted to reconstruct this episode from the Tunaha perspective. He analyzes the affidavit sworn by Elder Chris Luke in 2012 for the BC Court of Appeal and attached to the appellant's factum for the Supreme Court hearing in 2016, as well as some interviews given by Luke in the local press. This alternative account shows that the picture of a single individual being struck by a Damascene bolt of divine light, to use Conrad Black's expression, is both an oversimplification and a distortion. To begin with, we learned that Luke was the elected chief of the Lower Kootenay Band for 30 years, notably from 1998 to 2010. In the affidavit, Luke explains his 2004 experience as having occurred as part of a group discussion about the project. Here is a key passage of the affidavit quoted by Carol. I reached a decisive moment in my life at a Tunaha community gathering in 2004. The Jumbo Glacier Resort was the topic. There was some discussion of ending permits for hunting grizzlies in the area if the resort went ahead. The question was then raised as to how this might affect our tradition of taking grizzlies for certain ceremonial purposes. It was then that someone stated that the grizzly bear had no voice. When I heard this, I was disgruntled, and I thought to myself, maybe they don't, but they have us. I then stood up and said, how can you say that they have no voice? The grizzly bear has songs, a dance, and ceremonies, but they need our voice and our support so that their place won't be eroded. We can't allow the development in that area. Luke goes on to say that it took him another 5 years and 2 heart attacks before he came more fully around to realizing, understanding, and accepting what he was required to do. After his second heart attack in 2009, as he lay in his hospital bed, he experienced visions that strengthened his resolution. Luke briefly described these visions when he spoke at a meeting held to commemorate the 1-year anniversary of the 2010 Katma Declaration. And an account of his talk was published in the local press. Luke's experience is described as a visitation that he received from the grizzly bears and that convinced him that he had an obligation to ensure the rejection of the development proposed for the Jumbo Valley. In his 2012 affidavit, Luke notes that, and I quote, our Tunaha tradition does not permit us to share details about our ceremonies and spirituality with persons outside our communities. But a combination of circumstances and spiritual responsibilities may require us to say more than we would normally. With a threat to Katma and my duty to step forward as a spokesman for the grizzly spirit and bear, I have chosen to share a little. My choice has been made in consultation with other Tunaha persons, including knowledge holders and leaders, and with their affirmation. So it seems that the lower court's narrative may have conflated in one epiphanial event what are 2 related but distinct episodes in Luke's own narrative. However that may be, here are the 2 main points that I take from the case for my argument. Firstly, what emerges from these documents evokes less the picture of a single individual having a sudden illumination than the picture of a gradual and more deliberative process influenced by discussions with knowledgeable members of the community. We only have a partial and fragmentary understanding of that process because it makes only a liminal appearance at the margins of the court's narrative. This is a function, however, of how the Canadian legal order is superimposed on the Tunaha legal order while remaining blind to it. Secondly, I want to flag the presumption that Chris Luke's experience can be equated to apparently equivalent experiences in contemporary Western culture. As anthropologist Sylvie Poirier writes, for many Indigenous peoples, dreams and visions remain a privileged medium of communication with ancestors, a source of knowledge and power. When an Inuit, a Cree, or an Australian Aborigine refers to dreams and dreaming, we can expect that they are talking of something different from our Western dream concept. Our conceptions of dream as solely personal and intrapsychic phenomena finds no room and makes no sense within a relational ontology and sense of self. That the dream or visions that Chris Luke experienced in his hospital bed may be an appropriate resource for normative reflection and argument in the Naha legal tradition is something that we should not exclude, and that indeed we should be able to acknowledge, if not share. This vision, like the earlier event narrated by Luke, can be seen as part of the collective process of reasoning through which Luke and other Naha try to clarify what upholding Naha law should mean in relation to the proposed resort. The forms that that kind of deliberation takes is what I would like to study further as my research project develops. For instance, I am interested in examining norms of secrecy and publicity. I am also interested in exploring forms of deliberation that do not primarily involve a weighing between pro and contra reasons, but take instead the form of a collaborative process through which participants try to clarify a vision or a set of principles and their practical implication. This form of deliberation is also what is going on in drawing out law. This brings me back to the beginning of my talk and to Borrow's remark at the end of drawing out law's preface. Because time is slipping, I will simply read with you again the end of that first quote that I find so important. The idea that the differing voice and style of these two works exemplifies upon a legal pluralism should not be reduced to one kind of argument that creates a fuse or shared horizon. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Dominique. Maybe you can stop sharing your screen and we can bring everybody on. So we have about 15 minutes, 15 minutes for some conversation. As I noted in the chat, if you want to pose a question, you can raise your hand digitally or you can put it in the chat. Who would like to pose the first question? Colin, good to see you, by the way.
Hi, Paul. Thanks, Dominique. Very interesting. I guess I have two questions. One is about the characterization of Western law as though it's as settled as to what the grounds of law in Western law is. I think you depicted one version of a certain view, roughly legal positivism, but as a matter of just jurisprudential debate, legal positivism is not universally accepted as providing the best account of sound legal reasoning in the Western tradition, and some versions of natural law theory, which would allow for more expansive resources in the articulation of sound legal arguments, have vigorous defenders. So I just think as a descriptive matter, it's a bit more complicated on the Western side. The second question is whether what you said about the Tanaka case tells us something about the limitations of the Canadian Western legal system, or whether what's really at stake in this instance is a very difficult but important issue about jurisdictional authority, right? So American law and Canadian constitutional law are very different, right? There's no notwithstanding clause in the American Constitution, no Section 1 limitations in the American Constitution. So the appropriate legal reasoning to resolve debates are very different. Sometimes there's dispute who gets to decide an issue, right? And so you might think that this is precisely at stake. In this case, the Tanaka might be claiming it's our law that has authority in this domain, not Canadian law. Yeah. That could be true, but that wouldn't show that the reasoning of the Canadian court with respect to the norms of Canadian law was defective. And I thought it wasn't clear whether you thought the Canadian law reasoning was defective or whether this was a jurisdictional dispute. Fascinating.
Thanks. Thanks, Colin. Dominique?
Yes, so I will take the second point first. I'm I'm not, I agree. So I think one of the conclusion perhaps of the paper, but this is not what I wanted to highlight here, is that Canadian judges should not have to are not competent to say whether to what is Naha law, and perhaps there should be a mixed jurisdiction, when issues of land are not settled. I don't know, but that's not what interests me here. What I really wanted to show, and here my point is not about jurisdiction, but is really the problem of how the Western legal discourse in general tends to see what is part of an indigenous legal discourse. We tend to pigeonhole, to say this is a religious belief and we'll have to see whether it's protected or not. And so the way we categorize things is not respectful of how indigenous law functions. And so my point is a very simple one, is how we can be able to read the Katma Declaration and the kind of reason that goes on there as a form of legal reasoning, which is different from our form of legal reasoning. But that we should be able to accept that as a form of legal discourse, though it is different from ours. That's the only point that I'm making. It's a very simple point. Then we can discuss about who should have jurisdiction in an issue like the Katma. That's another issue. And as for your first comment, I think that Burroughs says that the different traditions can be put into conversation with one another, especially one of the reasons why he says that is that our traditions are more complex than the easy summaries that we give sometimes. And I think that that's a ground for hope. But I do think that this fundamental difference that I highlight in the presentation, so the differentiation of social fears, the fact that that Western law wants to separate itself from spiritual foundations. I think that that's you don't think so? Well, we have to discuss this further if you don't agree.
This might be a bottle of wine conversation more than a 7 minutes left conversation. Thanks very much for that question, Colin. I would love to have you guys tease that out at a coffee talk at the center. Rod Dobell asked a great question in the chat box. Rod, do you want to pose it yourself? Oh, Scott, we just need to go ahead.
You have to let me unmute myself.
There you go.
Great. I'm wondering actually whether that conversation between these approaches wouldn't be easier. Maybe the distinctions aren't quite so hard if we consider that the process that's being described, process that is described, for example, in Burroughs' example of the handling of the prairie. That's really a social process. It's a source of law, but in the Western sort of tradition, you see it as more of a decision-making process, not simply a legal process. We have this process of deliberation and participation at local level, and we develop social decisions, which may end up being translated into law, but we are we're talking about different scales, if you like, of social process. The indigenous process is capturing that whole social process of deliberation at local level. And I would argue, I guess, that spiritual considerations could perfectly well enter the Western social process of developing law as a source of law, but it's not part of the legal process of interpreting the law. So I wonder whether part of it is that we're talking at different scales when we speak of the indigenous tradition as being more comprehensive, reflecting many voices, many sources, that could be done in different language as part of Western democracy, if you like, rather than Western legal tradition.
Thank you. That's a
Thanks very
very interesting comment. I will have to think about that, but it's thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean,
thank you very much for this.
Rod, that was an excellent question. I wonder, Dominique, if Rod is drawing attention to the kind of semantic issue here about what we describe as law, and I take one of John Borrow's projects being, the kind of a broader reading of that term, mm-hmm. and a richer reading, which would give us some sense of the power of that sensibility, the normative, deliberative sensibility within Indigenous traditions. So I wonder, I mean, since John is here and he has been invoked so many times in the in the lecture, you could respond to that if you want, or Dominique can riff on that.
No, but I certainly think that that John's understanding of law makes it a lot richer, especially for someone like me who comes from a more of a civil law and I would say French education. So for us, the law is what the legislature does, right? So it's very formal and very, we have a very specific understanding what the law is, whereas the law is something that we make when we interact with each other. So it's closer to what Fuller, for instance, said about the law. Yeah? So I agree with that in part, but I would be interested to hear what John has to say.
Well, I'm just very grateful for the way that you've reviewed the work, and I find lots of resonance in it. And of course, thank you for translating that book and getting it in another place. I think it's right that I'm not just talking about Indigenous modifying law, but rethinking law itself in terms of not only in the Western structures, but also in Indigenous contexts as well. And so what you've described is trying to open up all of those spheres and then give us a place of participation in that, so that law is not something that's just done to us, but that we ourselves are active agents in the relationship that we might find with so-called law in that other way. So thank you. That was wonderful, Dominique.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. I'm just mindful of the time, but I also see that Tricia Rankin Sebastian has a very good question in the chat box. Tricia, I don't know if I see you on my screen anymore. Well, there you are in the corner. Would you like to pose your question?
Yes, thank you for unmuting me. So I'm a settler scholar from the United States. I became a permanent resident in 2021. And so basically a lot of the context for this discussion is very new to me because, as you're aware, the United States has a very different relationship with their Indigenous people than Canadians do. And so as part of my research involves the translation of legalistic and policy and procedure and strategic planning documents into terminology and language that the average person can understand, which is very similar to the thesis for this presentation, which was translating indigenous views of law into a way that Western people could understand. And so my question was about school codes of conduct and how some people in the community of the school board meeting that I went to, they were concerned that there wasn't like a legal code that would say, hey, this is, if a child makes this infraction, this is the punishment that they will receive. Again, very similar to legal code. And so if the school board has a stated goal to be inclusive of Indigenous ways of being, what would be the solution or the amalgamation of satisfying the teacher's need to feel safe and protected by the district if a child is behaving in a way that is dangerous to them, but also holistic and social justice forward?
Thanks, Tricia. Thank you. It's a huge question, but now
Paul,
you have a minute to
I
answer.
thought we had an agreement that only easy questions were allowed to.
Sorry, that was a bit of a trap.
No, but this is a great question, I think there's a great book that's been that was written no, not that long ago, by Brian Garston on saving persuasion, on the fact that in the European tradition, we like rules. We like rules because they're easy to. We don't have to think. And he says that we have, in a sense, we are not giving enough importance on judgment. And that's one thing that I find extremely interesting in indigenous legal traditions, but also what I call the mode of reasoning, is what Burroughs calls the indirect teaching mode. And the fact that you're told a story or you're told something, and then you have to think about it. You're not told what to do, but you're told to, use your judgment, use your head, as some people would say, to figure out what is the right way to act. And I think that's it's difficult to in schools or in classes to go back to that kind of way of thinking. But I think that there's perhaps much to learn there, especially in a school context. That's why I'm interested in all that has to do with deliberation, with all these issues. I find really fascinating, but I don't have a neat answer to your question. It's much too large for that.
That was, Tricia, you'll have to come up and be a fellow at the center if you're going to be asking such great questions.
Yeah.
And Dominique also now has material for her next book, or article at least. Thanks very much, Dominique. I really appreciate that lecture. That was really wonderful. So same time, same place next week. Lawrence Strumos will give a lecture on notions of justice among activists opposed to the Trans Mountain Pipeline. So I think in some ways you'll probably see some similar themes arise in Lauren's deliberations next week. So thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week. And for the rest of you, have a good week. Bye, everyone.